After the defeat of the revolutionary process between 1925 and 1927, an extremely repressive regime led by Chiang Kai-shek is imposed on China. The heads of the murdered revolutionaries, especially the women, are exposed in the villages to serve as examples. Between 1927 and 1937, 3 million people were killed in massacres and murders. Half of the 60,000 members of the Communist Party are exterminated. This, together with the industrial destruction that takes place in the 1930s by the Japanese invasion, drives the proletariat out of the political scene. Nevertheless, following Stalin's guidance, the Communist Party of China continued to carry out armed insurrections, defeated one after another. In September 1927, Mao leads 3,000 men in an insurrection in Hunan. Hundreds are dead, but Mao manages to escape and takes refuge in the south of the country with a small group of militants. From there, they begin to organize a popular army, whose social base was the landless peasants. Zaidu and his soldiers joined him, as well as a large deserting army of the Kuomintang army, led by Peng Tuhui. The base of the Red Army was formed. In 1929, a guerrilla warfare began, liberating small villages in the regions of Jiangxi and Hunan and carrying out the agrarian reform. Between 1934 and 35, however, Chiang Kai-shek could lay siege to the territory and force the flight of Mao and his army. 1 million peasants are killed by the Kuomintang. The peasants are definitively defeated in the south, and Mao begins a march to the north in the episode known as the Long March, during which a meeting of the political committee is held and Mao becomes the leader of the party. There began the formation of popular communes inspired by the Russian Soviets, with successful experiences of collective exploitation of the land, from the expropriation of the lands of large landowners and rich peasants, but isolated from the urban proletariat. Japan, which had controlled Manchuria since 1931, went on an offensive to southern China and the Yangtze River Valley in 1937. The peasants, who raised their heads again, reacted with the occupation of land outside of the control of the Communist Party of China. The party's main policy was fighting the Japanese invasion, and it defends the formation of a united front with the Kuomintang. Chiang Kai-shek agrees and comes to be considered by the Communists as the only government of China. The Red Army is under the command of the Military Affairs Commission of the national government, and Mao liquidates the Soviets and abandons the struggle for agrarian reform. The terms of the agreement, published on July the 15th, 1937, states that World War II, between 1939 and 1945, strengthened Japan's occupation of China and continued to advance, favoured by the Kuomintang's policy of not inciting the Japanese in order to buy time while waiting for the Americans to defeat them. To prevent the country's economic collapse and fall under the Japanese control, the United States granted the Kuomintang loans between $25 and $50 million between 1938 and 1941. But the Kuomintang regime was decomposing. Corruption was increasing with bribes and trade with state assets to enrich Chiang's family. The destruction caused by the Japanese during the occupation exacerbated poverty and misery in the countryside, among the workers of the cities, and even among the petty bourgeoisie, who increasingly shied away from the Kuomintang government and its policy of capitulation to the Japanese. The government represents now the most reactionary sector of the ruling classes, the landowners, and imposes a dictatorial rule, contrary to any modification of the social structure of the countryside. However, agrarian reform and land occupations by peasant communes already reached 100 million people in the liberated areas in the north of the country, about 20% of the population at the time, promoting a de facto rupture between the Kuomintang's political leadership and the rebellious peasant masses. Chinese women are subjected to retrograde customs, such as tying the girl's feet, arranged marriage from birth, or being treated as the property of the father and the husband. They saw in the revolution an effective means of achieving their liberation. Women's associations were set up in the villages, charged with punishing men who abuse women, training women to work the land, and participating in the revolutionary effort. Thus, women were asserting their rights in practice, choosing a partner, getting divorced, working, eating the same food as the husband and father-in-law, participating in village elections and rifle training. In the liberated regions, the multi-class governments consisted of a third of communists, a third of representatives of peasant organizations, and a third of intellectuals or rich peasants, including landowners, applied a moderate agrarian reform decreed by Mao's army. One could only occupy the lands of wealthy peasants whose land was not being worked by their owners. From the end of the war, China has entered a deep economic and financial crisis. About 30% of the economically active population lost their jobs, wages were frozen, and food prices soared. A sack of rice sold for 6.7 million yen at the beginning of June 1948 would cost 63 million in August. While in Europe, the Soviet leaders signed the Yalta and Potsdam agreements, in China an agreement with the United States allows the delivery of Manchuria to the Kuomintang, while Stalin pushes Mao to accept the formation of a national coalition government with Chiang Kai-shek. This government was endorsed on October the 11th, 1945, at a People's Consultative Conference, which adopts a series of resolutions on the organization of a coalition government, reconstruction of the country, military problems, convening a constituent assembly, and the unification of the armed forces. In February, the unification of the armed forces takes place under the patronage of General Marshall. The United States sends military experts to China to train Mao's army, where they remain for about 1 year. But Chiang does not respect the agreement and launches an attack on the liberated territories. Finally, after a year of hesitation, the Communist Party of China launched the policy of expropriation and distribution of the landowners' land in the summer of 1946. This process of confiscation of land spreads throughout China and exceeds the limits imposed by the communists, that reaches the rich peasants and the bourgeoisie as well. Revolutionary enthusiasm takes over the country. The peasant associations reappear and take power in the villages. This in turn speeds up civil war. Chiang launches a violent offensive against the peasants and the Communist Party that represents them. Chiang's offensive ends in his defeat and in the triumph of Mao in all China. This is the military victory of the revolution. It was a great revolutionary triumph that ended the fascist regime of Chiang Kai-shek and more than 100 years of imperialist domination, and through the revolutionary action of the peasant masses, the largest agrarian reform known in history. By early 1948, the situation of Kuomintang was hopeless. Submerged in an immense economic and political crisis, the government collapses, and Chiang resigns the presidency in January 1949 and escapes to Taiwan. On October the 1st, Mao Zedong declared the founding of the People's Republic of China.
中华人民共和国中央人民政府今天成立了。
The Central People's Government is formed, a coalition of 14 political parties with Mao in the presidency. The class collaboration policy, known as the Bloc of Four Classes, was stamped on the national flag with the five-pointed star representing the Communist Party of China and its four secondary stars representing the four classes that formed the new government. It's Mao's party army that seizes power and imposes the regime of the army on the state. That is, unlike the Russian Revolution of October 1917, a regime of workers' democracy is not imposed, nor is there a policy to end bourgeois rule. Land reform was imposed by the peasants themselves, who forced the government to legalize it. Only in 1953, faced with the danger of the US invasion of Korea, the Chinese Revolution was revitalized and the expropriation of the bourgeoisie occurred. Thus, the social revolution comes to an end. The bourgeois disappears as a class.